Welcome to Religion in Praxis. I'm starting with a very special announcement today. We got some Spotify data, statistics that is really a very big deal for us, the people who are doing this podcast. A heartfelt thank you to our loyal listeners spanning in 36 countries, and that's actually 28,000 times, which I find unbelievable. I actually got back to this a few times, seeing the numbers, and thanks everybody. Your engagement has truly transformed this journey into something really special, from starting just as a kind of experimental work, interviewing a few interesting colleagues. Now we're setting the standards really high, and we promise to build on this and create a better product in the future, and rest assured we're actually working on that. Now let's get actually to the episode, and the podcast today will have an interesting theme, death and dying, but interestingly we'll speak about the religious aspects of this. And in today's episode we're honored to have Dr. Jakob Wirén with us from Lund University. Our discussion today centers around Dr. Wirén's expertise on religious aspects of death in Sweden, a topic that promises to offer unique insights and perspectives. And besides his academic contributions, Jakob also brings a wealth of practical expertise from his role as a theological secretary to the Archbishop of Sweden's Church of Sweden's National Office in Uppsala. So join us in welcoming Dr. Wirén today. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So we start with the kind of a broader question. How do Swedish secular values influence society's perception of death and the grieving process?
I think there are many interesting aspects to this, and there is a kind of interplay between, on the one hand, secularization, as you mentioned, and on the other hand, the quite strong Lutheran heritage in Sweden. And perhaps death and cemeteries and burial are an interesting place where this becomes clearer than in many other areas and contexts. And I think that what we see here is that the Swedish society is sometimes secularized in a Lutheran way. So there is a kind of Lutheran secularization, so to put it, and we can see that in the cemeteries and also in the legislation when it comes to death practices and cemeteries. That even though the legislation is of course neutral to different religious traditions, it is still shaped by how Lutherans envisage death and burial, and that is, one can see several, I think, several examples of that. And to just one more thing in terms of the general picture, I think that if we think of religion as something that is private, individual, something that is textual based, that is voluntary, or if we see religion as something that is public, necessary, collective, oral, and ritually based, both of those descriptions are perfectly fine as describing religion, but though they are also quite different. And in the Lutheran tradition, I think that the former of those have been prioritized: the individual, the private, the textual based.
That's the nature of the Lutheran secularization that you speak about.
Exactly. So that is what we see in legislation and in our understanding of death and burial. Whereas other forms of religion that may be more common in Catholic countries, in Muslim countries, and so on, are not that clearly expressed.
How do Swedish policies on end-of-life care reflect to the country's philosophical stance on dignity and autonomy? Because the way we see Sweden as a foreigner living here right now, it seems a very sort of individualistic and yet collectivist in some mysterious way. So it's actually the individual autonomy is valued hugely. It's a very tolerant society. It's a very open society. And there are a lot of philosophical questions on ending of life. And how does that work?
I think we see a mix of several different things. The trend of individualization is certainly a strong one, and I think it comes with secularization also. When the Church of Sweden or the religious rituals practices are not necessarily the guide, then one needs to find another one, and here individuality comes to play. We see that in several studies when it comes to both the funeral ritual, but also the other practices related to taking care of the body and burial, that individualization is a strong trend in many ways. And we also see a increasing number of deaths without any ritual at all. So people die, the body is taken care of, and it's buried, but there is no religious or non-religious ritual.
Do you know the stats approximately?
It is difficult, because what the scholars see then is that sometimes there can be a private ritual that is not accounted for anywhere. It may be at the hospital, for instance. The close relatives they come together and they share some memories, and that's about it. And that is not accounted for. But we can see that it is at least increasing. And another trend that we see is that to see the funeral as a public event, that was a self-evident thing from before. Now it is shifting towards becoming more of a private thing. So that is also a trend that we see in this process. And maybe one last thing that one can reflect on, that is, and that is of course a theological thing as well, but that is, when we have a funeral ritual, is that conducted for the sake of the dead person or for the sake of the living and grieving? That is also a shift where we see that from being focused on for the sake of the dead person, it is more a ritual for the sake of the grieving and the...
Guide us through the process itself. So the person dies, and then what happens if we're just following this traditional trajectory of I want a religious ritual for my whatever member of the family, God forbid, and then what happens?
Exactly. So you die. You are sick. You come to a hospital and you die in a hospital. And during that period, it is the healthcare legislation that applies, and then at this place you can come and see the body and have a certain kind of farewell at that point. And
in the hospital.
Yes, and then normally you contact a funeral director that takes care of much of the process, and also the arrangement that needs to be done to make preparations for the body and so on. And there is a funeral ritual that can take place in a church, but it can also be in a more neutral ceremony hall of some sort. And then when the actual burial takes place, then we have another kind of legislation, the cemetery legislation that applies. And what is interesting here is that in this process we have the healthcare legislation, and then we have the funeral legislation. But there are several things that are not accounted for in any of these legislations that, for many religious minorities' perspective, are self-evidently a part of such a ritual, such as the ritual cleansing of the body, for instance. That is not accounted for in the healthcare legislation, and it's not accounted for in the funeral and burial legislation, and that is that is one example of this legislation being conducted from a Lutheran perspective, and there are other such issues, such as the question of time from when a death takes place to when the body is buried. In many religious traditions, the aim is to do that within 48 hours. In Sweden, that takes that the statistics say that it takes on average almost a month, and here Sweden is among the among the countries who have the most length from death to burial.
So is it a religious understanding of what constitutes the death in terms of how Lutherans envision what death is, like philosophically or epistemologically, or is it more practical matter that there is this legislative aspect and just it takes time to organize things and interpretations vary, what constitutes death, what not. So how does it work when it comes to practice, when it comes to, for example, this kind of ambiguity between what is death? When does it exactly count as death? Mm-hmm. And because, again, it might be 1 month, but in certain religions it might be a no-go zone for keeping it 1 month. How does that kind of relate to the bigger questions of religious origin about the survival and this eternity of the soul and whatnot?
I think that it may be a part of this transition that we spoke of before from being focused on for the sake of the dead to for the sake of the living and the grieving. Yeah. So I mean, one could of course describe that as a process of secularization. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't necessarily say that it has to be that. I think there could be, I mean, also from within the theological religious traditions, there could be reasons to focus also on the grieving and on the close relatives and so on. But given this shift of perspective, I think that may be a reason also why it takes longer time. And in many countries, and in Sweden in particular, we also have more complex family structures now with bonus parents and bonus children and so on. That makes it a bit messier, I think, to find a date for burial and so on. So I think there are several reasons that come together when we see this development. But one is, I think, the shift from the dead to the living in terms of focus, and another maybe the complex family structures, and maybe a third that there is no strong religious tradition saying that it needs to be very fast for the vast majority of the population in Sweden.
What happens with the mixed marriages, for example? How does it work when one parent, one member of the family is from another religion? Is there a kind of conflict that you have seen or encountered, or what kind of challenges that brings?
Yeah, there is of course a kind of negotiation that needs to take place in those situations, and many times it works well, but it takes a little bit longer time. So that may also be a reason, but a reason for the longer time. But of course, sometimes it is also it is so loaded that it is difficult to really solve it, and one needs to mediate somehow. And here we have an interesting construction in Sweden, where the former state church, the Lutheran Church of Sweden, is responsible for not for the funeral rituals of all, but for organizing the cemeteries for all people in most parts of the country. And that means also that the parishes in Church of Sweden are responsible for dealing with some of these negotiations, not necessarily when it comes to ritual, but it may also apply to burial practices, for instance, whether cremation or not, and so on. So here the Lutheran Church of Sweden and its priests and other employers have a role to play also in relation to Muslim and other citizens.
How does the Swedish approach to death education in schools shape children's understanding of mortality?
That's a good question. I don't really know how to answer that. My impression is that death as such is not a very strong topic in the Swedish school system. There is a common mandatory subject called religious education, which is going through all the world religions, their holy books, and prophets, and a little bit more. But it doesn't deal with the issue of death as such, at least not necessarily. I would say that it is somewhat marginalized as a topic in the Swedish school system. I think so, at least.
And in a country with a high rate of atheism, I wonder, how do Swedes find meaning and closure after death of their loved ones? You mentioned that the focus is on relatives, on the living. You also mentioned the bonus family. Many people might not know exactly what it is, so elaborate on that, please, so that we kind of get into the bigger picture of complex family structures here. So how does that work?
I think that one theme that we can see is that secularization is perhaps not as deep and as widespread as we sometimes think, or maybe this is an area where religious and other values are shown in a clearer way. I mean, if we look at the death rituals and other practices connected to burial and cemeteries, we can see that many do far more than the actual handling of the body requires. So there are symbols and rituals that goes beyond what the rational handling of the body requires. One takes the children draw pictures and put in the coffin other things to accompany the deceased person and so on. So I think that is one aspect in terms of high atheism and so that in trying to find meaning and closure, one develops rituals of various kinds, and we can name them religious or not. I mean, that is a question of discussion, but new ritual emerges. Another such ritual, which is not completely new, but has in the Swedish society grown tremendously the last 20 or so years, is to visit the cemeteries and the graves for All Souls Day in November. So I mean, it's kind of an old church holiday, but if you visit a cemetery during that period, All Saints Day, All Souls Day in November, you'll see that practically all graves have candles lit, and there are people. They're so crowded that you can't even find a parking lot, and a lot of people come there in order to visit their loved ones' graves, and if they happen to be in a city where they don't have any relatives, they still visit a cemetery. So that is sort of a new ritual, and we can also see in the digital society that we see that digital rituals in terms of social media and other things also appear, so emerge.
What role do Swedish natural burial practices play in the cultural narrative surrounding death, and are they indicative of a deeper ecological philosophy?
It's also interesting. There is a Swedish religious scholar called David Surfjell, and he describes the religiosity of the Swedes as the mentality of Swedes as a pine forest people. So our connection to trees and to the forest is very strong, and that there is in this connection there is some kind of spiritual or even religious dimension. So that is his argument, and I think that could be seen also in relation to death practices. There are several cemeteries who are designed as forest cemeteries with a lot of natural trees growing, not nicely designed parks, but rather forests. So that is perhaps one trend, and another trend which is not that common but still exists is the desire to be buried in the woods, in the forest, or so. So you can see that kind of connection in burial practices.
That brings me to the question of the folklore in a way. So how has the history of Swedish folklore and its tales of afterlife persisted or changed in modern attitudes towards death? Is there anything meaningful to dig into that?
If we go back to the Lutheran practices again, which I think maybe the Lutheran way of thinking about death has been a counter narrative to some of the folklore narratives. And in terms of relationship with the dead, we have two prominent Protestant theologians, Eberhard Jüngel and Søren Kierkegaard. And Jüngel, in terms of death and the relationship to the dead, he defines death as Verhältnislosigkeit, as the end of all relationships. That is Jüngel's definition of death. And Kierkegaard, his definition seemed to be opposite. He says that to love the dead ones, that is the highest, most supreme form of love. So that's the most, so not Verhältnislosigkeit, but the most supreme form of love is to love someone, a deceased one, because that is that can never be a selfish love, because we never get anything in return. That is Kierkegaard's rationale. And what both of these thinkers presuppose, I think, is that there is no real mutual relationship between the living and the dead. So either death is Verhältnislosigkeit, or it's a really one-way relationship, as in Kierkegaard's view. And I think that both of them are wrong, and I think that is maybe also a shift that is becoming increasingly clear, that we have a continuous relationship between the living and the dead, not necessarily in a metaphysical way, but they still affect us, and we affect the memory of them, and we keep their phone numbers in our cell phones, and we write on their Facebook posts on their anniversary death and or on their birthdays and so on. So maybe in this, when we reconsider the relationship between the living and the dead, maybe some of these folklore things also reappear, not in the same way, but we maybe see these kind of things that from a Lutheran perspective have been very looked upon with great suspicion. We know we don't want. There is no relationship with the dead, and of course it has to do also with the Lutheran insistence that there is no purgatory, there is nothing between death and resurrection. So I mean, it's a theological thing as well. But I think that is something that is renegotiated, and that some of the folklore narratives and tales reappear in this process. But of course some of them also don't.
As I briefly mentioned in the introduction part, we're proud of the fact that we're listened in 36 countries, which I still couldn't believe, really. And so what can the rest of the world learn from Sweden's approach to palliative care and philosophy of death with dignity? I know Swedes are not nationalists, so that's not the very right question, I presume. But let's speak in kind of very technical terms.
So I think there are many things not to learn also, but I think that in terms of the public conversation about these questions, because these are really sensitive questions, they are difficult questions, but I think that we they are not so polarized in Sweden. We are still able to not turn this into a culture war. We are struggling and negotiating questions of the beginning of life and the end of life in a I think constructive and balanced, constructive and balanced way. So that is one thing I think that is good to be patient with the fact that these are difficult questions. We have different positions, but we are still able to discuss it in a constructive way. That is maybe one thing. Another thing that has to do with individualism and autonomy, that there is a backflip to that also. But I think if you now ask for the good things, I think that there is a strong focus on the autonomy of the patient, of empowering the individuals and their decision making and their role in the process of sickness and dying and decision making and so on. So I think that ethical perspective on the individual is there are good and strong sides to this. And maybe a third thing, going back to the cemeteries, I think that we, to a large extent, people of different faiths and different religious traditions and so are cohabiting at the cemeteries. There are different quarters for Muslims and for Hindus and so on, but still within the same burial ground. And I think that is also a sign of some kind of coexistence and even perhaps cohesion that is positive. And many Swedes with a background in other countries choose to be buried in Sweden rather than repatriated to their country of origin, and maybe that is also a small sign of being anchored, feeling at home in Sweden.
And so this property, this basically the cemeteries are property of the state, I presume. So it's a very technical application for the space.
Of the church, actually.
Of the church?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, okay. So notwithstanding your religion, you can actually be buried in pretty much Christian property.
Exactly, and then this is a really good and interesting question, because then the Church of Sweden has the property and also has the responsibility to make room for burial ground for all citizens, but then not to make it a Christian space, but rather a space for all. So it's not hallowed ground or in that sense, but rather ground for all.
And that is received, obviously, since I've personally also seen in the Lund cemetery different the people of different religion has been buried there, and it's demonstrable, and you can see the different sort of even the posture of the dead's face in the whether the cemetery has a face, a picture of the dead person or not, and then you can see also religious symbolism, and you can definitely differentiate between different religions, and so there is no backlash, no kind of challenging, or there is no real debate about that in terms of that. Is it canonical to allow different religions to be buried in here or not, and what kind of conversations are inside the church on this matter?
Exactly. This is very visible when you go to a Swedish cemetery. You can see these, if it's a larger one, particularly in the cities, you can really see these different quarters and that they resemble different traditions and religious traditions. And I think that there are many debates in relation to this. So it's not very very easy. There are theological debates, there are political debates, and so on. But I would say that it works at least rather well. And from perhaps the most heated debates actually in latest have been from how to put it, from a right-wing extremist or maybe a populist or racist perspective. So there's been resistance in villages where the Church of Sweden realized that we have to extend the burial ground here to make room for another Muslim quarter at this cemetery, or maybe an entire Muslim graveyard here. And then there is resistance from the local village that no, we don't want the dead Muslims in this in our village, not in my backyard, so to speak. So and then of course the Church of Sweden representative find themselves in a situation where they, on behalf of the common good, has to defend the right for people of other faiths to be buried, and this construction is perhaps not always known by every citizen, that this is the task of the Church of Sweden, not of the government to do this. So that's one example of a very unfortunate but still an existing discussion that Church of Sweden representatives sometimes find themselves in. And then, if I may, another such example, which is different, is that when say a Muslim or so would be buried, then of course it's not the task of the Church of Sweden representative to go and say Christian prayers over that quarter, but then sometimes it is the task of the Church of Sweden representatives to collaborate with representatives from these different faith traditions in order to do a multi-faith somehow inauguration of that part. So maybe the Muslim and the Hindu and the local mayor maybe also can walk around from quarter to quarter at the cemetery and inaugurate the different parts. So in that sense, I think the cemetery is an interest, not always easy, but an interesting site of interreligious negotiation and interreligious cooperation in a secular society, and yet also a very multi-religious society.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also brings the idea of social structure in a way to the equation. So how has the Sweden's social structure, known for its welfare and social support systems, influenced the way individuals confront existential questions about mortality? Because we have seen, I mean, I lived in various countries, but the welfare system and social support here is, I think, very distinguished and very, exceptional in so many ways. I wonder what's your take on that.
One aspect of that would perhaps be that the level of there is a high level of trust and also a high level of expectation of what the society, quotation mark, should do. What is the society's responsibility, and that perhaps also makes the relatives and the friends and other persons' role in the death process and in handling the body very limited. So one assumes that this is something for the society to take care of, and I think that there are good and positive sides of that. It is a little bit of an equalizer. You don't have to be rich and have very many friends in order for things to be done, so to speak. There is really something that the society does together, but also it can of course create a little bit of loneliness and also a little bit of distance to death. You can be an adult and have only seen dead people on the pictures and in the movies. So it's a little bit mixed also.
So Jakob, drawing from your unique position as a theologian and a theological secretary to the Archbishop, how do you interpret the shifts in attitudes toward death and afterlife within Swedish society, especially against the backdrop of Western philosophy and Lutheran secularization that you mentioned? From your theological viewpoint and experience, how have you seen this attitudes towards death and afterlife evolve and change? And we'll finish with that.
I think that we see a development of different sorts, but one is that we are not as secular as we thought we were, and I think that in our way of dealing with death and burial and cemeteries, that is really an arena where this becomes more clear than before. I think this is also an arena where the fact that Lutheran tradition has formed the Swedish society, that this is an arena where we can see this in a clear and interesting way. And this is also an arena where the Church of Sweden, as only one of the denominations of many others in Sweden, appear in a very particular way that I think is also worth consideration from both part of society and from part of the church itself.
Dr. Jakob Wirén, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for joining us and our audience on this enlightening journey. And we'll look forward to bringing you more engaging conversations with leading experts in the future episodes of Religion in Praxis. Until then, take care and stay curious.